I'd like to welcome Eric Weiner. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He's a former foreign correspondent for NPR. He's traveled all over the world and has lived in India, Jerusalem, and Tokyo. He has previous books, The Geography of Bliss, Man Seeks God, The Geography of Genius, and we're here to discuss tonight the Socrates Express, in search of life lessons from dead philosophers. Eric writes with intelligence, curiosity, and humor. He's a keen observer of life and its absurdities. He's very funny. He makes philosophy very approachable, and that's part of the wonder of this book. So welcome, Eric, to Friends at Home.
Thank you, Karen. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the nice introduction.
Well, I found out about your book from a friend who read it and said, Karen, you got to read this book and you got to invite him to be on your Friends at Home event. So here we are. It all worked out. So thank you very much for joining us. So tell me, I'm just going to ask a few questions and see where this goes. But, you know, questions
are good.
Philosophy is always, for me, kind of a deep and hard topic. But somehow reading your book, I didn't find it so. So tell me what philosophy is.
Well, first of all, I'm glad that my book did not give you a headache or confuse you. I think you're not alone, unfortunately. I think, you know, when I was working on the book and, you know, I mentioned to people working on a book on philosophy, they sort of got this pained expression on their face that, you know, afraid I was going to ask them a very difficult question. And it's a shame because that's not what philosophy is. It's not what it began as in the Western world, at least in Athens some 2,500 years ago. You asked, what is philosophy? I like the simple definition. You know, philosophy comes from the Greek word philosophia, which means love of wisdom. And there's nothing complicated about that. There's nothing difficult about that. I mean, it might be difficult to achieve wisdom, but philosophy, that definition doesn't talk about being wise necessarily. It's about loving wisdom. So if you love wisdom and you're attempting to be wiser in your life, I think you're a philosopher.
And you make the distinction between knowledge and wisdom. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, we confuse those two words, and I'll throw in a third word just to really make things interesting: information. So I think of it as a pyramid. We can throw in a fourth word, data, but I won't do that, even though you're on the edge of Silicon Valley there. Information is a jumble of data points, basically, that aren't necessarily connected. Knowledge connects those, and it's a more organized form of information. But wisdom is something else entirely, and it's not really on a spectrum. It's not like you get more information, then you have more knowledge, then you're wiser. Because wisdom is knowing what to do with this information and this knowledge. And in fact, you can have too much information, too much knowledge, which will make you less wise. My favorite quote about this is from a British musician named Miles Kington, and he said, "Knowledge is knowing that the tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is not putting it in a fruit salad." So wisdom is much more of a how than a what. And we live in a society that really values information, data, to some extent knowledge, but wisdom not so much, which I think is a shame. And I hope my book is in some small way a corrective for that.
Got it. So wisdom is a more pragmatic.
Yeah, pragmatic, but not in the small p, but in a big P. Ultimately, it's wisdom is how to live, and that is something that I think interests everybody. And if we were to just go back again to ancient Athens, you know, the philosophical schools of, say, the Stoics or the Epicureans, and they were just less than a mile away from each other in their encampments, but they were philosophical schools, but not schools as we think of it. They were places you went to get physically fit. They were places you went to socialize, places you went to learn as you do in a university today. But it was also a big dose of Oprah style wisdom, like, how do I live my life? And we've come a long way from that time. And there is an effort, not just by me, but by others, to revive that ancient and original purpose of philosophy, to live better lives.
Right. I think about hippie movements and ashrams and other sort of alternative
it's all
living situations, right? It sounds
right.
like
And
that was what was happening to the Stoics and the
right. They were sort of combination universities, hippie communes, fitness centers, self-help therapy sessions, all rolled into one. Now we're segmented, we're fragmented, and we go one place for our head, to university or high school, whatever. We go to, where do we go for our heart? Well, if you're a religious person, you'll go to a church or synagogue or mosque. But what if you're not? You're sort of stuck with pop psychology, with good psychology, with little bits and pieces of wisdom you might pick up from your grandmother or your best friend. But philosophy, that the good kind, I think, presents it in an organized manner, in a way you can wrestle with it yourself.
You say that philosophy demands, it doesn't coddle.
Yeah, it's not easy. and Socrates learned this because he went around, asking people a lot of annoying questions, and he was practicing philosophy, but they didn't appreciate it much, and ultimately sentenced him to death. I guess the idea behind philosophy is it's less spa experience and more boot camp in the gym experience. It's more building muscles. It's more, thinking about hard problems, not complicated problems necessarily, but hard problems. Like, what's the right thing to do in a certain situation? What is the ultimate purpose of life? And the goal is not to just sort of, stare at, contemplate your belly button, trying to figure out what the meaning of life is. I think true philosophers, as I define it, are less interested in the meaning of life and more interested in leading meaningful lives. It's not exactly the same thing. So it's hard, but hard in a way like going to the gym. You hopefully get results and you're fitter and you look buff. And that's hopefully the results from engaging in what I would call a mindset of philosophy, a life of philosophy.
Mm-hmm. And you chose 14 philosophers to represent in your book.
Right.
Why 14?
Well, because there was originally 15 and one got killed off. It wouldn't be a book if you didn't leave someone on the cutting room floor. 15 was a rounder number, but Kierkegaard, I couldn't wrap my mind around Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher. And then there were 14. I wanted this book, in my previous books, I've gone to places and it's been 6, 7, 8 chapters, 6, 7, 8 ideas or places, more like a big, 6-course meal. I wanted this to be more like a Spanish tapas meal where you have lots of small plates. So I wanted to take a big, fairly wide survey of philosophy. And 14 ended up being the right number. But you asked why these 14? Partly it was ones who spoke to me. This is personal. These are people, if you're choosing a menu for your guests and you're choosing 14 dishes, you're going to choose ones that you like, and hopefully they'll like them too. But I wanted ones where I could distill them down to a how-to question. How to get out of bed in the morning, how to wonder, how to see, how to enjoy, how to fight, how to be kind. So I looked for ones where I could tease that out. And I wanted sort of a broad sample across the ages. And I've got everyone from Socrates 2,500 years ago to Simone de Beauvoir, who didn't pass away until the late 1980s. So a big span of time and a big span of geography. I didn't want it to be only Western philosophers. Philosophy is a Western-oriented word, but it's not the West has no monopoly on it. So there's Confucius from China and someone you may not have heard of, Seishonagon from Japan, and it seems to me I'm forgetting someone, but we've got Gandhi, of course, from South Asia. So sort of like a taster menu. Is that the term? I think it is a tasting menu. It's a tasting menu. Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought it might be fun to challenge you and see if you could describe each of the, because we're not going to have time to talk about all 14. We just, that's not going to work. So
right.
I thought as a little tasting menu, to go with that metaphor, can you describe each philosopher in like 5 words or less?
5 words or less. Okay.
Want me to give you the names?
Yes, if you can run through, and I will do my best.
Okay, Marcus Aurelius.
Marcus, 5 words. It's nice under the covers.
Socrates.
Socrates. Ask questions, annoy people, repeat. There you go.
I love this. Rousseau.
Right. Rousseau. The heart knows all.
Thoreau.
Henry David Thoreau. Simplify life and see clearly.
Schopenhauer,
the grump, but I'm going to say listening is an art.
Okay, Epicurus,
not to be confused with Epicurus, the website.
Right.
Very different. Desire little, enjoy much.
Simone Weil.
Simone Weil.
Oh.
Yeah, I discovered that's how it's pronounced. Who knew? Attention equals love every time.
And Gandhi.
Mahatma Gandhi. Don't defeat enemies, convert them.
Confucius.
Kindness is learned, study diligently. That's 5.
Yeah, okay, you made it.
All right.
Say Sean again.
Hope we're not being timed. Say Sean. Hers
No,
is simple. Small is beautiful. Yeah. That's a simple one. Nietzsche. When in pain, dance.
Interesting. Okay. I have a note here that says every truth should be accompanied by at least one laugh. So,
that's a good one. I'm not sure who said that, but I wish I had said that.
Nietzsche said that.
Nietzsche said that. Yeah, he probably
did.
It's in
your book.
Oh, there you go. All right. I knew it sounded familiar. Epictetus.
Epictetus. Thank you.
Yes. Control your reactions, not events.
De Beauvoir.
Simone de Beauvoir. Life is absurd. Embrace it.
Okay. And Montaigne. Yeah. Montaigne.
Yeah. Let's go with 4 words for him. What do I know? Which was his motto, actually.
Oh, great. And you said he was your philosophical soulmate.
Yes, I like Montaigne. He went up into, so if you don't know much about Montaigne, I'll give you the crash course. 16th century French dude, I think was his title. He was actually fairly elite. He had a family sort of estate outside of Bordeaux. And after serving as the mayor of Bordeaux and like hating the bureaucracy and having to get away from the coronavirus of the day, which was the bubonic plague, he went up into his tower, which I visited, outside of Bordeaux in the countryside, and he went up a spiral staircase, and he had literally 1,000 books in there, and he sat there and he wrote, and he wrote, and he thought, and he wrote about life, and he was in a lot of ways an amateur philosopher. He came to it later in life, as I did, and yeah, as he wrote his essays, he was the first one to use the term essay, which means comes from the French essay, to try. So he was trying. He was just trying out these ideas, and he wrote about everything from thumbs and cannibals to death, which I write about. He wrote about death, and he wrote about life, and it's just all over the place. And I love his breadth and his humor. And yeah, he's probably the philosopher I most want to have a beer with, or a glass of Bordeaux.
Yeah. One thing that really struck me in the book was Nietzsche and the Groundhog Day metaphor.
Yes.
Because Groundhog Day is one of my favorite movies too.
All right.
And I remember leaving the theater when it first came out, and as we walked, there were 4 of us, as we walked through the parking lot, we were like, yeah, and there was that thing too, and that thing, and we kept pointing to all these philosophical lessons in the movie. So
I do think it's the most philosophical movie ever made, even though it's considered a romantic comedy. It's really, if you scratch a little, it is very philosophical, and it's not clear whether the screenwriters, directly borrowed from Nietzsche, but I think they must have been aware of his idea of his theory of eternal recurrence, this idea that you repeat your life over and over again, exactly as it is. And so if someone presents this information to you that, Karen, you will repeat your life over and over again, including hearing this guy, Eric, saying, Karen, you will repeat your life over and over again. So, and you can't, unlike in the movie Groundhog Day, you can't make edits or changes. You're just going to repeat it. Would you consider that a blessing or a curse? And it's Nietzsche thought it was partly like a scientific theory, and he never published his notes on it where he tried to prove it. I think he wasn't satisfied that he could prove it. I think of it more as a thought experiment, which can be thought experiments can be very useful. Get you thinking about, are you living a life where you would want to repeat everything, even the unhappy bits, over and over again? It makes you think, and that's the point of philosophy, I think, to make you think.
Yeah. The story about him coming upon that makes him sound a little nuts, though. The demon.
Oh, he was a little nuts. There's no, I mean, first of all these philosophers are a little nuts, or they wouldn't be philosophers, because they are, I mean, the only one that really was sort of, I guess Montaigne was a mayor, and Marcus Aurelius was an emperor, but even he didn't fit in really into the Roman system. So I think philosophers, sort of by definition, I say nuts. I mean, they're going to be outsiders. They're going to see things a bit differently. I don't think Nietzsche was crazy. He did have a breakdown later in life, but not when he was writing. But he was a little bit nuts in a good way, in that he would come up with this idea of eternal recurrence, or any of the other ideas these philosophers came up with. You have to look at life from an angle in order to come up with those ideas, I think.
Yeah, I can't. The deal with that one is, at least in Groundhog Day, the movie, you could change what you did every day, or at least Phil Connors did, right?
Right. He could
that's
improve
not what
himself.
Nietzsche's saying, right?
No, he's saying you're stuck with this. It's a little bit inconsistent, like, you're stuck with this, so do you want to make changes? But he's saying you can't make changes, but we want to make these changes. We want to edit our life. Benjamin Franklin, who's not in my book, but he talked about and he was a printer and publisher, he talked about these errata, these mistakes. And he said if he could do it again, he would release a new edition of his life with all the mistakes corrected, sort of like an updated book where the typos are fixed. And yeah, but I think the point of Nietzsche's thought experiment of eternal recurrence is, are you living it over again? And there's sort of one corollary to that is the marriage test or the divorce test, really. If you're recently divorced and you said to someone who's recently been divorced, and it can be a very difficult experience, knowing what you know now, would you get married again to this person? Mm-hmm. And often people will say yes. And so it sort of, the thought experiment from Nietzsche forces us to sort of look at our life as a whole, and as a piece, and that even though there are bits that are bad, clearly bad, like divorce or illness, we might answer yes, that we would live it all over again exactly that way. So,
yeah, there's a couple thoughts I have about that. One is, I think he said something like, you can't change what happens to you, but you can change your reaction to it.
That's a little bit Nietzsche. That's a little bit Epictetus in the Stoics.
Right.
There's some overlap, but the Stoics, remember my 5 words from Epictetus: control your reactions, not events. Yeah. My next book will be much shorter. It'll be just 5 words times 14, whatever that is. Yeah, and that Stoicism is enjoying a revival. And there may be people listening now who are into Stoicism, but it is definitely seeing its biggest revival since 300 BC. And I think it's because so many of us feel that life is out of control, that we don't have control over events. And here comes the Stoics, and to some extent Nietzsche, saying you can control a lot less than you think in your life. The stock market, wars in Europe, you can't control any of that. You can't even necessarily control whether, driving to work, you'll get there in one piece. But when bad things happen to you, all you can control are your reactions to it. And you have a lot more control, the Stoics say, over your internal life, a lot less control over your externalities, but a lot more control over your internal life. And if something quote unquote bad happens to you, you don't have to respond in a negative way, that you can control that. And that's a dramatic oversimplification, but I think that's essentially what the Stoics teach. And I certainly understand the appeal.
And somewhere in the book, there was discussion that resonated for me about bad things happen to everybody, right? But depending on how you process that, you can come out happier than you were before the bad thing happened. And in the end, you're kind of happy the bad thing happened because you have a new perspective on life.
Yes, it's
again for life.
Right. Again, the Stoics and some of the other philosophers too are less about finding answers to life's problems and then reframing the questions. If you're stuck in traffic. Now, first of all, you're cursing all the traffic, not realizing that you're part of the traffic. No one ever there's all this traffic here, but you're part of the traffic, but you don't, the other cars are traffic. You're just trying to get somewhere, right?
Yeah.
You could, and I don't mean to get too, Zen-like about this, but you could get frustrated and bang your steering wheel. The Stoics like Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and others would say, well, that's not going to change anything. You can't control the traffic by banging on your steering wheel and cursing. But you could reframe it as an opportunity to listen to an audiobook, or to listen to music, or to do some deep breathing, or to call your mother. I don't know. I mean, it could hands-free. Okay. So, yeah, that is largely what Stoicism is about. It's also, I think, what all these philosophies and philosophers are about is, it's sort of in a way philosophy not as a kind of science, but more as a kind of poetry of living. In this case, in this sense, the philosophers or all philosophers really, are less like doing the work of a scientist than doing the work of a novelist. A novelist, basically, you inhabit their world, and the novelist prods you to ask, what if life were otherwise? And that's what a lot of philosophy is. What if life were otherwise? What if you got into a car accident, you're not injured, but you don't get upset? What if you didn't get upset because you were an offender bender? What if you really paid attention to every moment, the way Simone Weil did? What if waiting for a train or an airplane became not something frustrating, but something joyful? What if old age is something that you dread, but something that you embrace fully? What if, a la Schopenhauer, you listen to music and you find it to be a transcendent experience that is truly spiritual? So what if life were otherwise, I think, is it's what if life were otherwise. Five words, I believe. What if life were otherwise is 5 words, I'm telling you. Yeah. So that's all of them summed up in 5 words.
Well, I have to say, I really like Schopenhauer, and I think that I focused more on his love of music and the pure joy and the sweetness of that in his life that I found really attractive. And
so yeah, let's give people a crash course in Schopenhauer. So 19th century German philosopher, his parents wanted him to go into business. They named him Arthur because it was a name that worked in English and German and French, and he could be an international businessman, and he would have none of it. He wanted to be a philosopher. But he failed academically. He was not a successful teacher. And he moved from, I think, Berlin to Frankfurt, where he spent the last 40 years of his life, lifelong bachelor, bit of a misanthrope. I would say a pessimistic philosopher, but all philosophers are at least a little pessimistic. He was a philosopher of pessimism. He developed a whole 1,000-page treatise on basically why we're living in the worst of all possible worlds. And most people don't get past that sort of grumpiness of curmudgeonliness of Schopenhauer, but he had his bright spots. He loved animals. He was an early advocate of humane societies. I mean, really in the 1850s, before it really was popular at all. And he loved music. And he talked about music as sort of the one way you can escape this worst of all possible worlds. And he wrote quite extensively about his philosophy of music and what happens to us when we listen to it. So he's ultimately, in the end, sort of grumpy but lovable, I would say.
Well, I definitely love him because he had a poodle, and I have 2 standard poodles, so that warmed my heart toward him. I also really enjoyed the Porcupine Dilemma. Can you explain that?
The Porcupine's Dilemma. So Schopenhauer asks us, now keep in mind, he's someone who has limited interactions with other human beings. And I think he's explaining himself in this, this metaphor. So imagine there's a herd of porcupines. What are they? A herd, a gaggle? Let's say a bunch. There's a bunch of porcupines, and it's a cold night, and they're out in the woods, and it's very, very cold. And the porcupines need the body warmth of the other porcupines to warm themselves. So they need to get close to each other to get warm, or they'll freeze to death. But if they get too close to each other, they'll puncture each other and die from puncture wounds. And in Schopenhauer's mind, that's the dilemma we all face when it comes to other people. We need the warmth of others, but if we get too close, I would say we fear, I don't know whether it's true or not, that we'll be punctured, we'll be hurt. Mm-hmm. And so for Schopenhauer, life was that constant negotiation, that navigation between getting close to people, but not wanting to get hurt. Ultimately, he chose solitude pretty much for the most part. He would attend the opera. He complained about the noise in the audience. He like me, he hated noise. I hate noise. I'm anti-noise. And Schopenhauer said basically there's an inverse relationship between your tolerance for noise and your intelligence. But basically, the more you can tolerate noise, the dumber you are, is what he said. So he wrote a whole essay about noise and how, and also about not just the noise, the clatter of, horse and buggies back then and machinery, but also the mental noise. And he, even though he was extremely well read, he read books in Latin and French, and he was extremely well read, but he said that basically that books can ruin you from thinking, that you should put the books down sometimes and just think out these problems for yourself. It was sort of an early, he was an early advocate of logging off and don't just Google the answers, figure it out yourself. And I think that's what he would do today. He would definitely set aside time where he was not online.
And he is the person who you identified as for your chapter on listening, right?
Yes, because he
sound
listened
is
to
important.
music. He listened to music. He hated noise. And I think there was also an intuitive listening to the heart, that he believed that, listening to your inner guidance. And that's why he advocated putting books aside too, that we have some inner wisdom in us, kind of similar to Rousseau, who we can talk about, who believed that basically we're born good and society corrupts us. And it's, he was the original advocate of the inner child and treating the inner child well. So
Schopenhauer or Rousseau?
Rousseau.
Okay, got it.
The Swiss guy. And he was all about getting back to nature. And this is in the 18th century. So you're thinking, well, didn't they have lots of nature? They did, but civilization was on the march and the Industrial Revolution was around the corner. And he's like, wait a second, we have this wounded child inside of us who has more wisdom than all this learning. And he was, and he loved to walk. That's why my chapter is called How to Walk Like Rousseau. And he would walk sometimes 20, 25 miles at a time and carry playing cards with him, where he would jot down notes and ideas that came to him. And a lot of philosophers and thinkers and writers have been great walkers. Dickens walked through the streets of London. Freud was a big walker, and Rousseau was a tremendous walker.
I have one other thing about Schopenhauer.
Sure.
I found really interesting his hierarchy of aesthetics, and
right.
In his description or your description of why pornography is not art. It's an argument I've heard for years, but I've never heard anyone say it in a way that totally made sense to me. And do you want to explain that a little bit?
No, it's actually my explanation, sort of through Schopenhauer. He thought anything that increased desire. I should add that Schopenhauer was one of the early hippies, in the sense that, and I went to look at his worldly possessions, and it's not a museum. He doesn't get a museum, right? He's too grumpy. He gets just a box of his stuff, and there are a copy of these ancient Hindu texts in the Upanishads. In the 1850s, he's reading these Indian texts, and in his living room, he's got a statue of the Buddha, which is probably common in Alameda these days. There's probably one Buddha in every living room, but back then it was unusual. So keep that in mind when I tell you what his ideas about art and desire. He thought art should never increase your desire. So if you look at a still life of a bowl of fruit and it just makes you hungry, the artist has failed, right? Art should be transcendent, shouldn't be stirring these animal desires like hunger or sex in you. And the sole purpose of pornography is to stir desire. And so therefore he would say, I don't know what they had in terms of pornography back then, but he would say that therefore it is not art. And he had the hierarchy, and I think architecture was toward the bottom. and it went up from there, and music was off the charts, like the highest form. So if you listen to a beautiful piece of music, it may stir feelings of contentment or feeling in you, but probably not like desire in that sense. So yeah, so Schopenhauer had these early Buddhist tendencies, and I just found it interesting to see, before it became a whole section in Barnes and Noble, New Age and Eastern religions, that there were these pioneers like him and Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau had a copy of the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu holy text, in his little cabin there on Walden Pond. So yeah, it's quite interesting.
I wanted to talk about Thoreau next. We don't have a lot of time left, but I did want to talk about Thoreau next, because he's in the chapter called To See Like Thoreau. And he talks about how to look at things. Can you give us a short story?
Well, I mean, this would be an example of, to give you a little insight into my process of writing this book, is so I had these how-to, each chapter is a how-to chapter. And so I thought I knew ahead of time what I was setting out to explore, how to do what. But sometimes I had to completely change my mind. So I went to Concord, Massachusetts, where Thoreau lived almost all his life, and where Walden Pond is. And I thought it was going to be how to live simply like Thoreau, or, how to have few possessions, or, something like that, because of his experiment on Walden Pond, where he went to the cabin and had nothing else, or maybe how to live alone like Thoreau. But I got out there and I started to read, not Walden Pond, which I have read, but his 10-volume long journal, which is very personal and a little more honest, I think, actually. And it became clear to me, and talking to other people, that it wasn't really about living simply or living alone. It was about seeing more clearly, that he was very much into cleansing the lens of perception so that he could see nature and see the world around him more clearly. And that's where the solitude and the simplicity came into play. And he was an incredible observer. If you read the journals of Walden Pond, and of not just the pond, but life around him. And he would look at the pond, as an example, from different angles. He would even invert his head, so he's looking sort of between his legs at the pond, to look at it upside down, which I tried at Walden Pond. And the blood rushed to my head and I almost passed out, but maybe I wasn't doing it right. So yes, he was about seeing clearly, and we often don't. We look, we glance, but we don't really see any more than we listen.
Yeah. So you did organize the book as a how-to in how-to chapters, but you also organized it with the metaphor of a day.
Right, because I had these 14 how-to chapters, and I looked at them, and to give my credit to my editor, Ben Lonin at Simon & Schuster, he saw it too, that it was the arc of a day. It was some of these how-to questions are the questions you would ask in the morning of the day being a life, okay? Mm-hmm. The arc of your life. How to walk, how to see, how to wonder. These are things a child learns, or in the case of wondering, that they're born with, I think. And then there are questions that you would ask in the noon of your day, in the noon of your life, how to be kind, how to fight, questions like that, how to pay attention. And then there are questions that really we wrestle with more intensely in the dusk, in the evening of our life, how to have no regrets, how to cope with adversity, how to grow old. And the last chapter is how to die, Montaigne. And he writes beautifully about that. And philosophy has something to say about old age and death that I think is very, very helpful. I think. And sometimes you freeze. Okay, I lost you for a second.
Yeah, my connection says it's unstable. Are we back?
We're back, I think, and we're stable. I thought you were just lost in deep thought, Karen. I thought, wow, she's
Taking time to
meditating.
think.
Yeah, but now like she's not talking. Wait, she's frozen. Okay.
You you were able to sort of internalize these philosophers in a way that you could have conversations with them, and you've done that a bit in our event tonight. And I'm wondering, like, that was a really entertaining part of the book for you to say, you know, I broke my phone, and what would, you know, Thoreau say about this, or what would
Right.
Schopenhauer say, right? And you actually, you know, you gave so much detail about what they were like, and some of these people didn't have, there wasn't a lot that they wrote, or like Socrates, for example, you know, it
He
wasn't
wrote,
he that wrote it, Plato wrote it, right?
Socrates wrote nothing, not a word.
Mhm.
And we know him through Plato mainly, and a few other sources. Yeah, and some wrote very little, some wrote a lot, some wrote too much. And I had to sort through, you know, volumes and volumes so that you don't have to. Yeah, I tried to, I see my task as to be an interpreter of the complex ideas, to simplify without oversimplifying, to be entertaining, yes, without that being a four-letter word, and to try to get to the essence of their ideas, or at least one of their ideas. Like Nietzsche had lots of ideas. I focused on his theory of eternal recurrence, to make it bite-sized, but to make it, you know, like when you have a really good tapas meal, each dish is small. It's small, but it's complete in itself, and it's rich, and it's full. And that's what I attempted to do here. So I did a lot more research than you would necessarily know. Hopefully it comes out in, you know, when in the writing, but, you know, I tried not to give into that weakness of, I read all these books, so now I'm going to, you know, make you listen to them. Or I'm not going to thrust them upon you. So, you know, if I read 3 volumes of Schopenhauer that were 3,000 pages and there was nothing there, there was nothing there. I was looking for the gems in there.
Yeah, well, I found it extremely entertaining to sort of bring these people back to life.
Yeah.
And you have a very humble humor about yourself. You include things about yourself and your family in the book,
Right.
which, you know, is pretty brave, I think. So it was
Brave of the, and brave of them as well. Yeah, no, I mean, I think philosophy, if it's going to be useful, has to be personal. And so I try to put myself out there, and to not, you know, not to be a know-it-all, but to sort of take the reader along with me, so that we're both learning about Schopenhauer or Nietzsche or whatever theory together, so that we're both in this together.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I really enjoyed that about the book. I have one last item on my list that I feel like I can't leave without discussing, and that is trains.
Trains. Yes,
All the way through the book there were trains.
yeah.
There were philosophical discussions of trains. You want to give them a little?
Well, it is called the Socrates Express for a reason.
Yes.
Well, I mean, first of all, I am a traveler by instinct, you know, and all my books feature some sort of journey. And it just dawned on me that I realized I really love trains, and that I can think on trains, and I cannot think on airplanes or buses or cars. I don't know, I just can't. But I can think on trains. And it turns out I'm not alone. A lot of writers, J.K. Rowling dreamed up Harry Potter when she was on a British rail train. There are philosophers, obviously from the time of train travel onwards, who have done their best thinking on trains. Wittgenstein, Austrian-born philosopher, said, something to the effect of, all great philosophical problems can only be addressed in train stations. And I think it's something about riding a train, the rhythmic motion, the serenity of it, that just lends itself to contemplation. So I go in this book to the places usually where the philosophers philosophize, but not always. Maybe it's some place where their ideas might come into play. But I went somewhere for each chapter, and I took a train. There's a train. Each chapter opens with a train ride, with me on a train somewhere. And I took some long journeys. I went from Athens to Copenhagen. I went across India. I went from Washington, D.C., where I live, to Portland, Oregon by train. That's 4 days, 3 nights on Amtrak. And I try to use these train journeys as interludes, sort of between one philosophical act, intermissions really, between one philosophical act and another. And it allowed me to sort of let my mind wander. So that was the notion there.
Well, I listened to it on Audible also. I wanted to show your book though. I want people to see that. Uh-oh, it's backwards, isn't it? Sorry. Sorry about that. And so I listened to it on Audible, and you read your book on Audible, which was really fun to hear you read it. And all the chapters opened with the train.
Yes.
And a horn, right?
I thought that was a nice touch. So as you mentioned, I used to work for NPR as a correspondent. So I read all my books through the narration, and I really love it. It's very intense. It's done over 5 days, but yeah, I don't feel a book is really done until I've narrated the audio version of it, and then I feel like, okay, yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So is there anything I haven't asked you about that you would like to tell us about, or that I should have asked about, or?
Oh boy.
5 words or less. No.
5 words. Small act of self-promotion is my first book, The Geography of Bliss. I'm not going away, don't worry. This is my first book, The Geography of Bliss, One Grum's Search for the Happiest Places in the World. It is, as we speak, being turned into a 6-part television series starring Rainn Wilson, who starred in The Office as Dwight. People know him as Dwight Schrute from The Office. And it'll be on NBC Peacock early next year. And I'm involved in the project, and that's a lot of fun. I'm learning a lot about Hollywood and how it works. And so, yeah, so that's happening. Look for that early next year.
Okay. And what can you tell us about the experience of Hollywood and turning your book into a
I think, I just watched the first, what they call rough cut of an episode. They just sent it to me a couple of days ago, and I was kind of nervous, but I think they've actually captured the sensibility. It's hard to see, because getting the book onto the screen, small or big screen, it's never seamless, and it's always different. So if they can capture the sensibility of my book and my my attitude toward my work, which that humble humor, as you called it very nicely, if they can capture that, it's wonderful. And I think they did. I think Rainn Wilson comes across as kind of me, but more famous and with more hair, and that's all I could ask for. So it's been a remarkably good experience. I know not every author has had such a great experience, but mine has been very good so far.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So now we need to get the Socrates. We need to get a movie about philosophy. Now, wouldn't that be great?
That would be awesome.
Yeah. So thank you. I enjoyed this.
Thank you. I'm glad you did. It was really, really, really wonderful having you here. And I'm going to have to call and thank my friend once we get off of this tonight, because this has really been a joy for me. And I should tell you,
Go ahead.
My son reads a lot of philosophy. He's 22, just graduated from college. He reads a lot of philosophy. And when I told him I was doing this, he went online to see which philosophers you were using in your book, and he approved. He thought that was a great. He thought it was a great.
Yeah, they say every parent's worst fear is that their child will major in philosophy. But actually, a lot of Steve Martin, the comedian, majored in philosophy. And there are lots of stories of philosophy majors who have gone on to great things and great riches. So,
Yeah.
so you
My
never
son was
know.
actually a math major, but he reads a lot of philosophy. So
Good.
it's a joy for him. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So supposedly in Plato's cave in his academy, it said, you know, you may only enter if you're knowledgeable in mathematics. So your son would get into the cave or get into the academy, and the rest of us would be outside.
Wondering, like Sisyphus, how to get in, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Eric. Much gratefulness to you for spending your time with us. I know your time is precious.
Thank you.
And we really appreciate that you spent an hour of your day with us today.
All right. Last 5 words. I had a great time. So there we go.
Great. Wonderful.
Okay.
All right.
Take care,
Thanks
everyone.
very much.
Okay.
You too.
Be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you all for joining us tonight. I do want to remind you that we recorded our event tonight, and the event can be found in a few days. You'll find it on our website and also on our YouTube site. So if you go on YouTube and search for Friends of the Alameda Free Library, you'll see a lot of the events that we've recorded over the last couple of years. We do have some events coming up that I can tell you about. Let me switch my screen here. On August 31st at 7 o'clock, we'll have an art docent program on Ramses the Great and the Gold of the Pharaohs. I can't wait for that one. That's going to be great. And another art docent program on September 14th on Faith Ringgold. Sorry, I wanted to say that right. Of the American people. And wonderful, wonderful exhibit. I can't wait to see it. And then there's a couple more in September, but I want to get to the next author program, which is on September 19th. Marjan Kamali discusses her book, The Stationery Shop. So please join us for those events. And remember that we're a nonprofit and we appreciate any donations that you can make to Friends of the Library. Someone just entered the link to our donation page in the chat. So if you feel like you can make a donation tonight, we'd appreciate it. And just use that link to get to us. Thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate seeing you at our events, and we'll see you at the next one. Good night.